So this is Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson. I'm going to start reading from chapter 1, page 19, and carry through to page 25. I skidded down a stairwell and crunched against steel gravel at the bottom. Sucking in air, I dashed through one of the dark understreets of New Cargo. 10 years had passed since my father's death. That fateful day had become known by most people as the annexation. I wore a loose leather jacket and jeans, and had my rifle slung over my shoulder. The street was dark, even though it was one of the shallow understreets with grates and holes looking up into the sky. It was always dark in New Cargo. Night Wielder was one of the first epics to swear allegiance to Steelheart, and is a member of his inner circle. Because of Night Wielder, there are no sunrises, and no moon to speak of, just pure darkness in the sky. All the time, every day. The only thing you can see up there is Calamity, which looks kind of like a bright red star or comet. Calamity began to shine 1 year before men started turning into epics. Nobody knows why or how it still shines through the darkness. Of course, nobody knows why the epics started appearing, or what their connection is to Calamity either. I kept running, cursing myself for not leaving earlier. The lights along the ceiling of the understreet flickered, their coverings tinted blue. The understreet was littered with its typical losers, addicts at corners, dealers, or worse, in the alleyways. There were some furtive groups of workers going to or from their jobs. Thick coats and collars flipped up to hide their faces. They walked hunched over, eyes on the ground. I'd spent most of the last decade among people like them, working at a place we simply called the factory. Part orphanage, part school, it was mostly a way to exploit children for free labor. At least the factory had given me a room and food for the better part of 10 years. That had been way better than living on the street, and I hadn't minded for one moment working for my food. Child labor laws were relics of a time when people could care about such things. I pushed my way past a pack of workers. One cursed at me in a language that sounded vaguely Spanish. I looked up to see where I was. Most intersections were marked by spray-painted street names on the gleaming metallic walls. When the great transversion caused the better part of the old city to be turned into solid steel, that included the rock and soil dozens, maybe hundreds of feet down to the ground. During the early years of his reign, Steelheart pretended to be a benevolent, if ruthless, dictator. His diggers had cut out several levels of understreets complete with buildings, and people had flowed to New Cargo for work. Life had been difficult here, but it had been chaos everywhere else. Epics warring with one another over territory, various para-governmental or state military groups trying to claim land. New Cargo was different. Here you could be casually murdered by an epic who didn't like the way you looked at him, but at least there was electricity, water, and food. People adapt. That's what we do. Except for the ones who refuse to. Come on, I thought, checking the time on my mobile, which I wore on the forearm mount of my coat. Blasted rail line outage. I took another shortcut, barreling through an alleyway. It was dim, but after 10 years and living in perpetual gloom, you got used to it. I passed huddled forms of sleeping beggars, and then leaped over one sprawled in the street at the end of the alleyway and burst out into Seagull Street, a wider thoroughfare that was better lit than most. Here, one level underground, the diggers had hollowed out rooms that people used as shops. They were closed up for the moment, though more than a few had someone watching out front with a shotgun. Steelheart's police theoretically patrolled the understreets, but they rarely came to help except in the worst cases. Originally, Steelheart had spoken of a grand underground city that would stretch down for dozens of levels. That was before the diggers had gone mad, before Steelheart had given up the pretense of caring about people in the understreets. Still, these upper levels weren't terrible. At least there was a sense of organization and plenty of burrowed-out holes to use as homes. The lights in the ceiling here were faintly green and yellow, alternating. If you knew the color patterns of the various streets, you could navigate pretty well through the understreets, the top levels at least. Even veterans of the city tended to avoid the lower levels, called the Steel Catacombs, where it was too easy to get lost. 2 blocks to Shoxter Street, I thought, glancing through a gap in the ceiling towards the better-lit, gleaming skyscrapers above. I jogged the 2 blocks, then swerved into a stairwell going up, feet falling on the steel steps that reflected the dim, half-functional lights. I scrambled out onto a metal street that immediately ducked into an alleyway. A lot of people said the overstreets weren't nearly as dangerous as the understreets, but I never felt comfortable on them. I never felt safe anywhere, to be honest. not even at the factory with the other kids, but up here with the epics. Carrying a rifle around the understreets was common practice, but up here it could draw attention from Steelheart soldiers or a passing epic. It was best to remain hidden. I crouched beside some boxes in the alleyway, catching my breath. I glanced at my mobile, tapping over to a basic map of the area, and then looked up. Directly across from me was a building with red neon lettering, the Reeve Playhouse. As I watched, people began pouring out the front, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I had made it just as the play ended. The people were all overstreeters, in dark suits and colourful dresses. Some would be epics, most would not be. Instead, they were those who had somehow gotten ahead in life. Perhaps Steelheart favoured them for tasks they performed, or perhaps they had simply been born to rich parents. Steelheart could take anything he wanted to, but to have an empire he needed people to help rule. Bureaucrats, officers in his army, accountants, trading gurus, diplomats. Like the upper crust of an old-school dictatorship, these people lived off the crumbs that Steelheart left behind. That meant they were almost as culpable as the epics in keeping the rest of us oppressed, but I didn't bear them much ill will. The way of the world was these days. You did what you had to do in order to survive. They had an old-fashioned style. It was the current trend. The men wore hats. The women's dresses looked like those from pictures I'd seen of old Prohibition days. It was a direct contrast to the modern steel buildings and distant thumping of an advanced enforcement copter. The opulent people suddenly began moving out of the way, making room for a man in a bright red pinstriped suit, a red fedora, and a deep red and black cape. I ducked a little lower. It was Fortuity. He was an epic with precognition powers. He could guess the numbers that would come up on a dice roll, for instance, or foretell the weather. He could also sense danger, and that elevated him to high epic status. You couldn't kill a man like him with a simple rifle shot. He would know the shot was coming and would dodge it before you even pulled the trigger. His powers were so well attuned, he could avoid a machine gun barrage, and if he would also know if his food had been poisoned or if a building was rigged with explosives. High epics. They're blasted hard to kill. Fortuity was a moderately high-ranked member of Steelheart's government. Not part of his innermost circle, like Nightwilder, Fireflight, or Conflux, but powerful enough to be feared by most of the minor epics in town. He had a long face and a hawkish nose. He strolled to the curb in front of the playhouse, lighting a cigarette, as the other patrons spilled out behind him. Two women in sleek gowns hung on his elbows. I itched to unsling my rifle and take a shot at him. He was a sadistic monster. He claimed his powers worked best when practicing an art called extispicy, reading the entrails of dead creatures to divine the future. Fortuity preferred to use human entrails, and he liked them fresh. I held myself back. The moment I decided to try and shoot him, his powers would activate. Fortuity had nothing to fear from a lone sniper. He probably thought he didn't have anything to fear at all. If my information was right, the next hour would prove him very wrong on that count. Come on, I thought. This is the best time to move against him. I'm right. I've got to be. Fortuity took a drag on his cigarette, nodding to a few people who passed by. He had no bodyguards. Why would he need bodyguards? His fingers glittered with rings, though wealth was meaningless to him. Even without Steelheart's rules granting him the right to take what he wanted, Fortuity could win a fortune in any gambling house on any day he chose. Nothing happened. Had I been wrong? Been so sure. Bilko's information was usually up to date. Word in the understreets was the Reckoners were back in New Cargo. Fortuity was the epic they target. I knew this. I made a habit, maybe even a quest, of studying the Reckoners. A woman, walked past Fortuity, tall and lithe and golden-haired and perhaps 20 years old. She wore a thin red dress with a plunging neckline. Even the two beauties on his arms. Fortuity turned and stared at her. She hesitated, glancing back at him. Then she smiled and walked up, hips undulating back and forth. I couldn't hear what they said, but in the end this newcomer displaced the other women. She led Fortuity down the road, whispering in his ears and laughing. The other two women waited behind, arms crossed, not daring to complain. Fortuity did not like his women to speak back to him. This had to be it. I wanted to get ahead of them, but couldn't do so on the street itself. Instead, I moved backward through a few alleyways. I knew the area perfectly. Studying the maps of the theatre district was what had almost made me late. I hustled around the back of a building, sticking to the shadows, and arrived at another alleyway. From here I could peek out and see the same road, but from another angle. Fortuity ambled along the steel sidewalk outside. The area was lit by lamps hanging from the street lights. The street lights themselves had been turned to steel during the transversion, electronics and bulbs included. They no longer worked, but they did provide a convenient place to hang lanterns. Those lanterns left pools of light that the pair moved through, in and out. I held my breath, watching closely. Fortuity was packing a weapon for certain. The suit was tailored to hide the bulge under his arm, but I could still make out where the holster was. Fortuity didn't have any directly offensive powers, but that didn't really matter. His precognition powers meant that he never missed with a handgun, no matter how wild the shot seemed. If he decided to kill you, you had a couple of seconds to respond, or you'd be dead. The woman didn't appear to be carrying a weapon, though I couldn't be certain. That dress showed plenty of curves. A gun strapped to her thigh, perhaps? I looked closer as she moved into another pool of light, though I found myself staring at her rather than looking for weapons. She was gorgeous. Eyes that glittered, bright red lips, golden hair, that low neckline. I shook myself. Idiot, I thought. You have a purpose. Women interfere with things like a purpose. But even a 90-year-old blind priest would stop and stare at this woman. If he went blind, that is. Dumb metaphor, I thought. I'll have to work on that one. I have trouble with metaphors. Focus. I raised my rifle, leaving on the safety and using the scope for a zoom. Where were they going to hit him? The street here ran through several blocks of gloomy darkness, broken only by the lanterns before intersecting Burnley Street. That was a major hub of the local dance scene. Likely the woman had enticed Fortuity to join her at a club. The quickest route was through this dark, less populated street. The empty street was a very good sign. The reckoners rarely struck an epic who was in too public an area. They didn't like innocent casualties. I tilted the rifle up and scanned the skyrise windows with my scope. Some of the glass-turned steel windows had been cut out and replaced with glass again. Was anyone up there watching? I had been hunting the Reckoners for years. They were the only ones who still fought back, a shadowy group that stalked, entrapped, and assassinated powerful epics. The Reckoners. They were the heroes. And that's all for this reading. I'll move on to chapter 2 in the next one.